Greetings, everyone. This is your online lecture for Unit 1 in Federal Government. And Unit 1 covers chapters 1 through 5. And I'm going to start off with just some discussion about chapter 1. Okay, so Unit 1 covers chapters 1 through 5. And this is your video lecture for chapters 1 through 5. So when we look at the first chapter, is about political culture. And political culture is something that very interesting. We know what culture means as that relates to race and ethnicity. Latino culture, Black culture, Asian culture, white culture. These are traditions and customs that different races and ethnicities have. And we've come to a point in our existence as a diverse, multicultural, multi-religious community in the United States. We're coming to a point where we're starting to understand how to talk to people from different cultures without being offensive or without making fun, etc. We know that. We're learning every day how to do it even better. But one of the things we're struggling with right now as a country is we don't realize that your political ideology, how you believe government should interact in your life, is also part of culture. Depending on what your parents do, where you live, how you grew up, what's your race and ethnicity, are you from the north, the south, one of the coasts, all of this affects how you identify as a Democrat, as a Republican, as a Libertarian, a Green Party member, as a non-voter, as an independent. All of that affects the belief system that you formulate. And what we're starting to see is we're not very good at talking to people who come from a different political culture. We tend to sometimes view them as the enemy or uninformed or misinformed. And what we need to start looking at is, depending on where people grow up, how they're influenced, what their family culture is, has a lot to do with where we end up identifying. As I stated earlier, the United States is a multicultural, multi-religious society based on freedoms. And that is a very strong founding influence. And we'll get more into that when we get into chapter 2, the founding and the second founding. But for now, out of chapter 1, what you really need to understand is that people run this country. And there are 435 United States congressional districts across the country. These are the U.S. House of Representative members. And all states get a certain number of representatives based on their population. And in a big state like Texas, that's really challenging because I live in Harlingen, and where I live here, the 2 congressional districts who are represented by Vicente Gonzalez in the upper part of the valley and Filemon Vela down more in Brownsville, the southern part of the valley, are both Democrats, are both pro-immigration with certain standards, pro-social welfare, because a lot of the need here and a lot of the culture here dictates that. And when people vote, in majority, they vote for people who represent the needs and the values of that district, of that congressional district. But Texas is such a big state. If you went up to Waco, the Dallas metropolitan area, you're going to see mostly Anglo, mostly male, mostly conservative, very different viewpoints on immigration, very different viewpoints on social welfare. And by that, I mean like children's health insurance, Medicaid, TANF, which is food stamps, food, supplemental nutrition assistance. You're going to see a very, very different take on that. And not that that's wrong, it's just that in that area, the majority of the voters who are voting those representatives into office are voting what they believe is best for their community. If you go over to East Texas, where you have the highest density of Black population, you're going to see the representatives there like Eddie Bernice Johnson, Sheila Jackson Lee. You're going to see them have a stronger public policy initiative as that relates to criminal justice, police reform, because that's the issue that is currently driving the majority of that community. So you don't have to agree with all of the representatives and you don't have to like them. But what you do have to understand is this is a democracy, and democracy means people rule. Demos, Latin for people. People run the show. And when a district, a group of people, a community of interest get together, they elect someone to speak for them in the places where public policy, laws, regulations are made. And they're going to have different takes on it. And again, you don't have to agree with them. But what you do have to understand is that they have been put in place by the majority of voters in that district to represent their interest. So when you take that 435 congressional seat delegation and put it in the House of Representatives in Congress, you can begin to see why government can be so complex and confusing and seem like it doesn't get anything done and it runs slow and, you know, all those things. I get it. I've worked in government for the majority of my adult life. But when you have all of these different diverse communities voicing their opinions, their priorities, then of course you're going to have to negotiate, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take compromise, and you fuss and cuss, and hopefully at the end of that process, you reach a public policy agreement that is best for the majority, not everybody. You know, I think that's one of the things that we have a tough time with today is that whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or a non-voter, whatever, you want everything the way you want it, when you want it. And that's just not always the way it works, especially when you have so many different beliefs, viewpoints, priorities, obstacles, cultures that are represented in the People's House, which is the United States House of Representatives. So that's, you know, a little bit about just the demographics of the country. Now, if you go over to the Senate side, you know, all states in federal government, in the U.S. Senate, get 2 senators. So the Senate looks different. There's only 50 senators. Excuse me, there's only 100 senators because there's only 50 states. Okay, so 50 states, all states get 2 senators. The senators tend to be more conservative. The senators tend to stay longer. There's not as much diversity in the Senate as there is in the House, because instead of elected officials coming from those small districts, those communities of interest, they're being elected by the whole state. And whoever is the majority of reliable voters in that state is going to elect a person to represent the majority of the voters in that state's priorities, obstacles, hopes, dreams. And sometimes that's different than what others in the state want, especially again in a big state like Texas. When you look at smaller states like Vermont, Rhode Island, Delaware, or states with lower population like Montana, big landmass, but smaller population, Alaska, big landmass, small population, they're much easier to govern as states. It's much easier to get representatives and senators that are more closely in alignment with what they feel is best because the population is diverse. But when you get to big states with lots of population, Texas, California, New York State, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, that's when you start seeing the diversity amongst representatives. But the senators tend to stay more conservative because older conservative voters are more reliable voters. We need to get more young people voting. We need to get more Hispanics, more minorities. We need to get a lot more people in the discussion. Regardless of what your political ideology is, there might be differences between what a younger person who identifies as Republican versus an older person who identifies as Republican. And the same goes true for Democrat. You know, me, I'm 54 years old. Some of the things that are important to me at this stage in my life are going to be very different than what some of you in a younger, newer phase of your life are going to be. Doesn't mean I'm wrong, doesn't mean you're wrong. In our country, we have the ability to speak through our elected officials and to try to elect people who we feel are going to do the best job for our communities, our state, and hopefully our country. So those are some things to remember about just who we are, the demographics, and how all that affects the ultimate outcome, which is the public policy that we all are governed by. Not all of us are going to agree with everything 100%, but what we're trying to do is create a government that can take care of the majority, and that creates compromise. Okay, so just a couple of things to remember from Chapter 1 in Unit 1. Next, we'll be moving on to Chapter 2.